The ferry's diesel engine rumbled, a dull counterpoint to the relentless lap of waves against the hull, a monotonous rhythm that had become the soundtrack to Dean's journey. He watched the mainland recede, a gray smudge dissolving into the horizon, and felt a strange mix of sorrow and grim satisfaction. Sorrow for what he was leaving behind, a life shattered into countless shards, and satisfaction for the sheer, physical act of severing ties. This was it. No turning back. He clutched the worn leather of his grandfather's journal, its pages brittle with age, the only tangible link he still felt to anything solid. The journey had begun days ago, a winding procession of roads and ferries, each mile pulling him further from the familiar, closer to the unknown. The final leg had been a tiny, rust-pocked vessel that felt more like a fishing boat than a passenger ferry, leaving from a remote dock after a perfunctory stop at a small, wind-battered border checkpoint. The official there, a woman with a face etched by sun and salt, had barely glanced at his papers, her eyes already fixed on the churning gray water beyond. Dean had felt like a ghost passing through, unseen, unheard. Now, the island was a looming silhouette, a jagged scar against the bruised sky. Even from a distance, he could feel its isolation, a desolate presence that seemed to actively repel the world. The air grew colder, sharper, tasting of salt and something else, something ancient and damp, like earth disturbed after a long sleep. Fog, thick and milky, began to roll in, swallowing the distant peaks until only the immediate, choppy water remained visible. When the ferry finally scraped against the barnacle-encrusted jetty, the sound was a harsh shriek of metal, a welcome end to the journey. The ramp clanked down, smelling of brine and diesel, and Dean stepped onto the uneven stones, his boots crunching on scattered shells and pebbles. The island air was a physical presence, heavy and cold, seeping into his clothes and bones. There was no one to meet him, only the ferryman, a man whose face was a patchwork of weather-beaten wrinkles, who simply gestured vaguely towards a winding, overgrown track. Up that way, he grunted, before disappearing back into the ferry's depths. Dean shouldered his backpack, the weight of familiar ache, and started walking. The track was barely a path, more a suggestion of one winding through stunted, gnarled trees that clawed at the fog like skeletal hands. The silence was profound, broken only by the mournful cry of gulls and the distant reconnect of the ocean. He expected to hear the lighthouse, a comforting beacon, but its beam was swallowed by the dense fog, its horn muted by the vastness. And there it was, beside it, hunkered low against the relentless wind, stood the cottage. It was smaller than he remembered from the old photographs, more dilapidated. A single, rusted weathervane, shaped like a forgotten sea creature, creaked mournfully on the roof. He approached slowly, each step kicking up damp earth and brittle, dead grass. The front door, a heavy slab of weathered oak, groaned as he pushed it open, revealing a choke of dust and the heavy, cloying scent of disuse. It was a smell Dean knew intimately from his own abandoned life, decay, stale air, and the lingering ghost of forgotten moments. Inside, the silence was absolute, pressing in on him. He ran a hand along the rough wood of the hallway wall, feeling the grit of accumulated dust. The air was frigid, despite the lack of wind within the cottage's thick stone walls. A faded, threadbare rug covered part of the floorboards, and a single, rickety armchair sat hunched in a corner, draped in a thin layer of dust. Dean pulled back the heavy, grimy curtains from one of the windows. A gray light filtered in, revealing motes of dust dancing in the stagnant air. Beyond the glass, the fog pressed close, a shroud that seemed to be actively trying to reclaim the cottage. He moved through the rooms, each one mirroring the last in its state of quiet decay. A small kitchen, its sink stained with rust, an empty larder, a bedroom with a narrow, iron-frame bed, its mattress a lumpy outline beneath a sheet. As he stood in the kitchen, a faint, almost imperceptible sound reached him. It was a low, resonant thrum, a vibration more felt than heard, coming from somewhere deep beneath the floorboards. He paused, tilting his head, listening intently. He dismissed it as the old house settling, or perhaps the distant rumble of the ocean through the island's rock. This place was old, and he was tired. He returned to the living room, his eyes scanning the dusty shelves. His grandfather had been a man of few possessions, a cartographer like Dean, though of a different era, tracing coastlines instead of digital topography. There were a few faded nautical charts, some old books on maritime history, and a collection of smooth, wave-worn stones. But then, on a small, rickety side table, tucked behind a stack of navigation logs, he saw it. It wasn't a shell, or a stone, or anything related to the sea. It was a small, crudely carved figurine, no bigger than his palm. Its head was too large for its body, and where a face should have been, there were only 3 shallow, circular depressions, like blind eyes staring out from a featureless skull. He picked it off. It had a faint, earthy smell, like wet soil and something else. Something metallic and sharp, almost like iron mixed with salt. He turned it over in his hand, a prickle of unease crawling up his neck. It was unlike anything his grandfather had ever owned, or anything Dean had ever seen in the man's meticulous, ordered world. The fog outside seemed to press even closer against the window panes, obscuring the view entirely. He felt a distinct, unsettling shift in the atmosphere, as if the very air around him had grown heavier, thicker with unspoken things. The island, he realized, was not merely isolated. It felt watchful, as though something ancient and patient had been aroused by his arrival, his gaze now fixed firmly upon him. Dean was determined to escape his past, but he had a sudden, terrible premonition that he had merely traded one cage for another, far more menacing one. The island, when it finally materialized through the persistent shroud of mist, was a formidable silhouette of jagged rock and sparse, wind-whipped vegetation. Disembarking felt like stepping into a different climate entirely. The air was thick with salt and the damp scent of kelp, clinging to his clothes and skin. A solitary structure, a corrugated iron shack painted a faded, peeling blue, stood at the edge of the small stone jetty. A hand-painted sign, barely legible through the grime, declared it the border checkpoint. Inside, a burly official with a salt-blasted face and eyes that seemed to have seen too many horizons grunted as Dean presented his identification. The official's gaze lingered on Dean's face, then flicked to the manifest on his desk, a worn ledger with brittle, yellowed pages. Another one, the official muttered, not to Dean, but to the silence that filled the shack. He stamped a form with a heavy thud, the sound echoing in the confined space, and waved Dean through without another word, his expression unreadable. The path to the cottage was little more than a sheep track, winding precariously along the cliff edge. Dean dragged his duffel bag, the wheels crunching on loose shale and embedded pebbles. The wind here was a constant vocal presence, a mournful lament that seemed to carry snippets of sound. Not words precisely, but inflections, like a conversation just beyond human comprehension. Yet, a shiver unrelated to the chill traced its way down his spine. The cottage stood alone, perched on a promontory overlooking the churning gray expanse of the sea. It was a stoic, stone structure, weathered by decades of maritime assault, its windows like vacant eyes staring out into the perpetual gloom. A squat lighthouse, its lamp long extinguished, rose beside it, a silent sentinel. Dust motes danced in the sparse light filtering through grimy panes. The air was heavy, stagnant, imbued with the ghost of his grandfather's presence. Dean set about the grim task of making it habitable, sweeping away cobwebs, airing out rooms. As he worked, he noticed the tide. Then, just as abruptly, it rushed back in, the waves crashing against the rocks with a force that seemed to shake the very foundations of the cottage. The water level rose several feet above the high tide mark, leaving a trail of fresh kelp and broken shells almost at the cottage steps, before settling back to a more conventional level. Dean, a man who understood the sea through charts and data, frowned. He tried to rationalize it, a rogue wave perhaps, or an unusual convergence of currents and atmospheric pressure, but the regularity of the phenomenon, the way it pulsed, felt deliberate. Later, seeking a place to store his few books, Dean knelt by a built-in shelf in what must have been his grandfather's study. His fingers brushed against a loose floorboard beneath the lowest shelf. Prying it up, he found a small, wooden box, sealed tight with rusted metal clasps. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a single, leather-bound journal. It was thick, its cover warped and discolored by water damage, the pages swollen and brittle. The scent of salt and decay clung to it. He opened it carefully, the spine groaning in protest. His grandfather's familiar, spidery hand filled the pages, but the content was anything but familiar. Early entries detailed weather patterns, lighthouse maintenance, mundane observations. But as Dean turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew frantic, the lines slanting wildly. They were not marine life he recognized. They were caricatures of nightmares. One recurring phrase, scrawled repeatedly in thick, insistent strokes, caught his eye, the deep song. It appeared again and again, sometimes underlined, sometimes circled, sometimes alongside crude drawings of ripples emanating from an unseen source beneath the waves. There were warnings, too, urgent and desperate, about the encroaching tide and the pull of the depths. Dean's breath hitched. He closed the journal, the heavy thud resonating in the quiet room. His fingers traced the water stains on the cover. The sketches were just fevered imaginings, the warnings the product of a lonely mind. He was a cartographer, a man of empirical evidence, of lines and measurement and verifiable facts. Natural phenomena, a trick of the light, the eccentricities of remote island life. He told himself this over and over, his logical mind desperately trying to draw a map around the encroaching unease to contain the unsettling implications of his grandfather's final, desperate entries. The cottage air, thick with the scent of salt and disuse, pressed in on Dean. He moved through the sparsely furnished rooms, each step echoing on bare floorboards. The ferry's dull thrum had faded, replaced by the relentless, hungry sigh of the ocean just beyond the bluff. He unpacked methodically, a cartographer's precision in every folded shirt, every carefully placed book. This was his refuge, his new beginning, he told himself, even as a chill that had nothing to do with the sea air prickled his skin. He remembered the finality of the border checkpoint on the mainland, the last official stamp on his old life before the ferry carried him into this new, isolated existence. His grandfather's study, a small, cramped space overlooking the churning gray expanse, drew him in. A heavy, leather-bound journal lay open on the desk, its pages brittle and yellowed. Dean had glimpsed it before, during the brief, unsettling visit to arrange the inheritance, but now, with the mainland a distant memory, he felt compelled to truly examine it. He sat, the old wooden chair groaning beneath him, and traced the faded, looping script. The early entries were mundane observations on weather patterns, lighthouse maintenance logs. But as he turned the pages, the tone shifted. The handwriting grew more frantic, the ink pressed deeper into the paper. References to the deep currents and whispers from below began to appear, at first interspersed with normal entries, then dominating them. Dean's brow furrowed. His grandfather, a man he barely knew, had been a pragmatic, solitary individual. This was unexpected. A large, circular area was marked with an X, accompanied by a single, unsettling phrase, Katharha, the drowned city. Below it, another scrawl, the pact holds. A drowned city? He needed more context, a grounding in the island's actual history. The next day, Dean drove his rented vehicle along the winding coastal road to the island's sole settlement, a cluster of weathered buildings huddled against the elements. She had him with reserved curiosity as he explained his interest in the island's vibler. Local legends, you say? The custodian's voice was dry, like rustling parchment. We have a few, if you've a mind for them. Old fishermen's tales? Mostly. She pulled out several dusty tomes, their covers warped by damp. Dean spent hours poring over the brittle pages, the air thick with the smell of old paper and brine. He found snippets, fragments that echoed his grandfather's journal, tales of the deep ones, of offerings made to the sea to ensure safe passage and bountiful catches. One particularly disturbing passage described an annual rite performed by the island's earliest settlers, a renewal of the ancient bargain to keep the sea's true masters at bay. It mentioned a sunken city, not by name, but by description. Cyclopean architecture beneath the waves, structures not carved, but grown. The pieces clicked into an unnerving mosaic. His grandfather wasn't just rambling. He was recording. The pact wasn't a metaphor. It was a tangible, terrifying agreement. Back at the cottage, the journal entries now screamed with meaning. The tide recedes. They stir. He was no stranger to loss, to the world's indifference, but this felt different. This was an active, malevolent presence, implied rather than stated, lurking just beneath the surface of the mundane. Sleep, when it finally came, was a descent into a nightmare of shifting, aqueous forms. The air was thick and briny, and a low, guttural thrum vibrated through his bones. He saw no face, no distinct shape, but felt an intelligence, ancient and hungry, observing him from an immeasurable distance. Dean woke with a gasp, heart hammering against his ribs, the taste of salt still on his tongue. The dream clung to him like a shroud, its icy tendrils refusing to release their grip. He swung his legs out of bed, his muscles aching, his skin clammy. The first rays of dawn were just beginning to filter through the window, painting the room in a weak, gray light. A faint, ethereal glow emanated from the base of the old wooden dresser. He knelt, his breath catching in his throat, a patch of something akin to moss, vibrant and pulsing with a soft, otherworldly blue light, clung to the aged wood. Its tendrils spread subtly, almost imperceptibly, as if breathing. It wasn't just on the dresser. He saw another patch, smaller, clinging to the edge of the worn carpet near the door, and another, a faint sheen, on the ceramic rim of the basin in the small bathroom. Bioluminescent algae. In his cottage, far from the sea spray, far from any natural source. Dean stared, his mind reeling. The sea wasn't just outside his window. It was creeping in, bringing with it a silent, insidious invitation to the deep. Dean felt the cold reality of it settle in his bones, a weight far heavier than any flood that rolled off the sea. The journal wasn't just a diary, it was a confession, a desperate plea. His grandfather hadn't simply chronicled a descent into madness. He documented a losing battle against an ancient, hungry intelligence. The tide recedes. They stir. The bargain weakens. The words echoed in Dean's mind, colder than the salt spray against the cottage windows. He was no longer just an inheritor of property, output of a terrifying legacy. It was too low to be the wind, too rhythmic to be the old house settling. He went to the kitchen to make tea, his movements stiff. As he reached for a mug, a small wooden spoon, left on the counter's edge, slid silently, inexplicably, to the floor. It clattered softly against the linoleum. Dean froze, his hand still suspended over the cupboard. He stared at the spoon, then at the counter. No vibration, no draft. Nothing. He picked it up, his fingers tingling with a strange unease. Later, in the living room, immersed once more in the journal's unsettling narrative, a book on the shelf above the hearth shifted. A heavy, leather-bound volume on maritime history. It tilted precariously, then slid off its perch, landing with a dull thud on the rug beside him. Dean flinched, his head snapping up. He scanned the room, the familiar objects now seeming to hold a silent, menacing quality. The hum was still there, a deeper vibration now, more insistent, working its way into the very marrow of his bones. It felt like the island itself was breathing, a slow, vast intake and exhalation. He walked to the window, staring out at the impenetrable gray shroud that had swallowed the horizon. His reflection stared back, superimposed over the swirling mist. For a split second, the outline of his face wavered, the features elongating, blurring as if submerged in water. His eyes seemed to sink deeper, the skin around them taking on a bruised, purplish hue. Then, just as quickly, it snapped back, his own tired, bewildered face staring out. He pressed his palm against the cold glass, his breath fogging the spot where the distortion had been. He was seeing things. He had to be seeing things. The hum intensified, a low, hypnotic drone that filled the cottage, making the very air feel thick and heavy. It wasn't just a sound. It was a presence, a pressure against his eardrums, a vibration in his chest. He started in the study, where the journal lay open. He ran his hands along the underside of the desk, feeling for loose panels, then checked behind the heavy bookshelves. He moved to the small, unused pantry off the kitchen, a place his grandfather rarely entered, according to his notes. He untied the knots, his fingers fumbling. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried seaweed, were several objects, a shark's tooth, polished smooth, its tip stained a dull red, a small tarnished silver locket containing a lock of faded, gray hair, and a handful of iridescent scales, unlike any he had ever seen shimmering with an unnatural light. These weren't just decorative, they were deliberate. Wards, offerings, a desperate attempt to placate, to bargain. The truth of his grandfather's struggle solidified into a terrifying certainty. He hadn't just observed, he had actively engaged. The hum pulsed, now almost a physical force, pressing in from all sides. He snatched the box, tucking it under his arm, and stumbled toward the door, driven by an instinct he couldn't ignore. He needed to get away, even if only for a few minutes, to clear his head. He barely registered the path beneath his feet, his mind reeling from the discovery. His grandfather hadn't been a victim. He'd been an active participant in some terrible, long-running drama. His feet carried him along the familiar, winding track that led to the island's western edge, a desolate stretch of land where the old, derelict structures of what was once a border checkpoint stood. A crumbling stone wall, a rusted gate, and a small, roofless hut marked the spot where, decades ago, attempts had been made to regulate access to the island. Now it was just another ruin, swallowed by the encroaching moss and sea spray. As he neared the checkpoint, the hum seemed to concentrate, vibrating in the very ground beneath his boots. The fog ahead of him thickened, swirling unnaturally, coalescing into a formless, shifting mass. It pulsed, contracting and expanding like a vast, amorphous lawn. It wasn't mist. It began to drift towards him, silent, inexorable. He stumbled backward, tripping over a loose stone, falling hard onto the damp earth. Then, with a slow, deliberate undulation, it began to expand, stretching outwards, engulfing the broken remains of the checkpoint, moving towards him with terrifying intent. The air in the cottage was thick with the scent of damp paper and old sea salt, a perfume Dean had come to associate with his grandfather's desperate legacy. He hunched over the journal, a magnifying glass clutched in his hand, his eyes burning from hours of intense scrutiny. The scrawled script, initially an impenetrable maze of anguish, was slowly yielding its terrible secrets. He'd begun to understand the idiosyncratic shorthand, the repetitive symbols that looked like distorted anchors or ancient skeletal fish. These weren't just the fevered ramblings of a man lost to the sea's influence. They were a meticulously, horrifyingly detailed account of a war. His grandfather hadn't simply observed the encroaching darkness, he had actively fought it. The entries weren't just chronicles of a descent, but instructions, warnings, and desperate appeals for vigilance. Dean traced a diagram of concentric circles, interlocked interlocked with the strange anchor-like symbols. Each tide, a whisper. Each storm, a claw at the veil. Sacrifice. He reread the word, a bitter taste in his mouth. What kind of sacrifice? And to what end? His grandfather hadn't been a victim of madness, but a guardian, a keeper of a terrible, forgotten pact. The realization was a lead weight in his stomach, heavier than any sorrow. His ancestor had not simply lost his mind. He had given it, piece by piece, to hold back something unspeakable. As Dean deciphered more, the room around him seemed to subtly shift, but it persisted, growing in intensity, a deep, rhythmic pulse that seemed to resonate not just in the wood, but in his very bones. It was the deep song, he realized with a jolt, the very sound his grandfather had described as the entity's ceaseless call. The sound was not constant, it ebbed and flowed. Sometimes a barely perceptible pressure behind his eardrums, other times a full-body drone that filled the small cottage. He pressed his palms against his temples, trying to push it out, but it was inside him now, a primordial bass note vibrating deep within his skull. He blinked, rubbing his eyes, but the distortions remained, subtle yet persistent. The line between what was real and what was merely a trick of his exhausted mind began to blur. He pushed back from the table, needing to escape the suffocating presence of the journal and the insidious hum. He walked to the window, pulling aside the heavy curtain. The fog outside was a living, breathing thing, a dense, gray wall pressing against the glass. Through a momentary thinning, a brief, ethereal rift in the vapor, he glimpsed something out on the island's northern ridge, a structure, barely visible through the swirling mist, something he hadn't paid mind to before, assumed was just another ruin. It was a skeletal framework of weathered timber and crumbling stone, a derelict gatehouse perhaps, its purpose long forgotten, but its form unmistakable. It looked like an abandoned border checkpoint, a place where lines were once drawn, now breached by time and decay. An entry in the journal which he'd glossed over earlier suddenly resurfaced in his memory. The old gate where the air thins and the deep breathes free. A necessary vigil, but the barrier grows weak. His grandfather had visited that place, had stood watch there, sensing the erosion of the boundary. It was a physical manifestation of the crumbling defenses, a testament to the losing battle his grandfather had fought. The hum intensified, now accompanied by faint watery echoes like immense bells ringing far beneath the ocean. Dean felt a profound weariness, a desire to simply lie down and let the sound wash over him, to give into the overwhelming pressure. But the image of his grandfather's frantic scrawl, the sheer determination in his final entries, spurred him on. He had to finish deciphering, to understand what his ancestor had done, and what he himself was now meant to do. He returned to the journal, his hands trembling slightly. One symbol, a spiral descending into a jagged point, was circled repeatedly. Beside it, a single phrase, the heart of the vigil, the root of the spire. Below the lantern, where the ancient stone sleeps. Below the lantern, the lighthouse. Dean's gaze swept around the room, then to the heavy, bolted door that led to the winding spiral staircase of the lighthouse tower itself. He avoided it, found it too stark, too much a symbol of his grandfather's isolation. But now, it called to him. The deep psalm was a roar in his ears, a dizzying chorus that made his head spin. He stepped inside the base of the tower. The stone walls, rough and ancient, seemed to absorb the light, plunging the space into a deeper gloom. He ran his hands along the uneven surfaces, searching. The journal had mentioned ancient stone, implying something older than the lighthouse itself. His fingers brushed against a section of wall near the base of the central column, where the stone felt unusually smooth, almost polished. He pressed against it, then again, harder. A wave of frigid air, thick with the smell of damp earth and something metallic, something truly ancient, washed over him. Dean stood at the precipice of the revealed passage, a hidden chamber, a crypt perhaps, beneath the very foundation of the lighthouse. His grandfather hadn't just chronicled the entity. He had built a sanctuary, a prison, a place of constant vigilance. And now, Dean was standing at its broken threshold, the terrible truth of his inheritance settling around him like the suffocating fog. The ritual was fractured, the entity stirring, and the burden had shifted inexorably to him. Dean's hand trembled as he gripped the cold iron handle, the deep so etched into the lintel above. His breath hitched, a ragged sound in the still air of the lantern room. He'd come this far, pushed past the crushing grief, the unsettling visions, the gnawing certainty that something ancient lurked just beyond his perception. Now he stood at the precipice of understanding, and the fear was a living thing, squirming in his gut. He twisted the handle. It groaned, refusing to yield fully. With a surge of adrenaline, Dean leaned into it, pushing with his shoulder. The old wood shrieked in protest, a sound like a tortured beast. And then, with a final, echoing thump, it gave way, swinging inward into absolute blackness. A blast of air, thick and cloying, rushed out to meet him. He recoiled, coughing, but his eyes were already straining into the void. The beam cut through the gloom, revealing not a winding staircase as he'd expected, but a narrow, descending passage carved directly into the rock. The walls were rough-hewn, slick with moisture, glistening in the lamplight. This was no ordinary part of the lighthouse. This was something hidden, something secret. He stepped inside, the heavy door groaning shut behind him with a finality that stole his breath. The passageway twisted downwards, a dizzying spiral into the ether. The passage opened into a vast, cavernous chamber. His lamp, so brave moments ago, now seemed utterly insignificant, its light swallowed by the sheer scale of the space. In the very center of the chamber, where the rock floor dipped into a shallow pool of black, viscous liquid, stood an immense, monolithic structure. It pulsed, not with light, but with a deep, rhythmic throb that resonated through the floor, up his legs, into his chest. The column was covered in strange, flowing glyphs that seemed to writhe and shift in the dim light, like something alive beneath a thin membrane, and at its base, where it met the black pool, the liquid swirled, not from any current, but from an internal, unseen force. This was the entity's gateway. He realized, his mind reeling. This was the border checkpoint between his reality and something else entirely. He took another step, then another, drawn ineluctably closer. As he neared the edge of the pool, the swirling vortex intensified. Strange, iridescent motes of light, like trapped plankton, began to appear in the black liquid, drawing patterns that defied geometry. Then, the murmuring intensified, becoming a chorus, a cacophony of voices that were not voices, but a vibration of pure consciousness. He gripped the lamp, his knuckles white, his vision blurred, the cavern walls seeming to stretch and contract around him. He looked into the vortex, and the world fractured. A vision, unbidden and terrifying, ripped through his mind. He saw the island, not as a solid mass of rock and earth, but as a fragile, dissolving membrane. He saw the lighthouse, a beacon of human defiance, crumbling, its light extinguished, swallowed by the encroaching black. And then he saw himself, the entity intended to reclaim everything, to pull the island, its legacy, and deem himself into its unfathomable domain, dissolving the boundaries between worlds, between self and oblivion. The hum intensified, a triumphant roar in his mind, affirming the vision, affirming the entity's intent. He was not just an observer, he was the next offering. The rusted bolts groaned, a sound like an ancient ship's timbers shifting under an impossible strain. Dean pulled, the cold iron handle scraping against the lintel, and the heavy door in the lantern room swung inward, revealing not a storage space, but a narrow, circular chamber, barely large enough to stand in. No windows marred its curved walls, only a single, rough-hewn stone altar-like structure in the center, slick with a perpetual dampness. A sudden, sharp pressure assaulted Dean's temples, as if his skull were a fragile shell about to crack. It wasn't just in his head. It felt external, a physical force pressing inward, seeking purchase. The whispers that had been a distant hum now resonated with an unnerving clarity, a chorus of guttural clicks and wet gasps that seemed to emanate from the very stone of the chamber. He stumbled back, heart hammering against his ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage. This was where it had been gathering strength, a festering wound within the lighthouse itself. It was no longer content to merely prod at the edges of his sanity. It was actively trying to force its way in, to tear a path through the fragile membrane of his mind. He scrambled away from the doorway, the suffocating presence of the chamber still clinging to him like an icy shroud. His breath hitched, his vision blurring at the edges as the room around him seemed to warp and sway. He stumbled down the winding stairs, his hand scraping against the rough stone. The journal, the only thing his grandfather had left him, a twisted inheritance of madness and desperate knowledge. He burst into the small, cluttered study, overturning a stack of charts in his haste. He snatched the leather-bound book from the desk, his fingers fumbling with the clasp. He flipped through the brittle pages, the frantic scrawl of his grandfather's hand a testament to a mind slowly succumbing. Dean skipped over the early, more coherent observations, searching for anything, any hint of a countermeasure. Then, a section, densely written, almost illegible, caught his eye. It spoke of the breaching, the final descent, and the turning of the tide. He squinted, trying to decipher the archaic language, the half-formed symbols interspersed with the text. To seal it, not blood, but the very eye of perception must be surrendered. A willing distortion, a mapping undone. The cartographer's sight offered to the deep to become a barrier. Dean's breath caught in his throat. A willing distortion, a mapping undone. The cartographer's sight, it clicked with a sickening certainty. The entity wasn't just trying to drive him mad. It was trying to remap his reality, to overwrite his senses with its own. And the terrible sacrifice was to willingly give up his ability to perceive reality clearly, to distinguish between the real and the imagined, to surrender his very sanity, his capacity for rational thought, to become a living, breathing barrier. He looked up from the journal, his gaze gaze sweeping over the familiar, yet suddenly alien, objects in the study. His hands trembled so violently he almost dropped the journal. This wasn't just a threat from outside. It was a threat from within his own mind, a war being waged on the battlefield of his perceptions. The border checkpoint wasn't just a place, it was a state of being, a threshold he was already teetering on. The ritual demanded he step over it, willingly, irrevocably. There was no other way. The island was screaming, not with sound, but with a visceral, silent shriek that tore at the fabric of Dean's perceptions. The entity's psychic pressure had swelled into an unbearable maelstrom, a cacophony of distorted reality that hammered at his skull. He stood by the lighthouse window, watching the storm rage, but it wasn't a natural storm. The rain lashed horizontally, not as clear drops, but as oily, viscous threads that seemed to cling to the glass, leaving behind iridescent smears. The wind, a living, howling thing, tore at the cottage, rattling the old panes until Dean half expected them to shatter inward. Yet, through the swirling chaos, he could see the grotesque transformations unfolding across the landscape. The crags that ringed the islet were no longer mere rock. They pulsed with a faint, bioluminescent glow, their surfaces slick and glistening with a mucus-like sheen. Patches of what should have been lichen had erupted into fleshy, undulating growths, resembling masses of sickly coral or pallid anemones. The sparse, resilient island vegetation heather, gorse had withered, their stalks blackened and twisted into skeletal claws, yet from their dying roots sprouted grotesque, bulbous fungi that shimmered with an unholy luminescence, like eyes watching him from the gloom. The very ground seemed to heave and sigh, a slow, viscous breathing beneath his feet. Dean knew this was the remapping, the entity's attempt to override his senses, to pull his world into its abyssal domain. He fought it, clenching his jaw, focusing on the rough wood of the window frame, the familiar scent of damp stone and old paper in the cottage. He would not yield, not now. He turned from the window, his gaze falling upon the leather-bound journal splayed open on the scarred table. Its pages, brittle and tea-stained, held the final, desperate clues. His grandfather's looping script, once a source of comfort, now read like a death sentence, each word imbued with a terrible weight. Dean had pieced it together, the fragments of lore, the old keeper's increasingly frantic entries. The entity demanded a price tethered to this reality. To sever it, to push it back into the depths, required a mirroring sacrifice, not of life, perhaps, but of self, of his very perception. He would have to offer a part of his mind, his cartographer's sight, to redraw the boundaries, to enforce the old pact once more. A sudden, violent tremor shook the cottage, rattling the very foundations. A high-pitched, almost imperceptible whine emanated from the island's core, a sound that seemed to bypass his ears and vibrate directly within his bones. The entity was stirring, its awareness of his intent growing. Dean pushed away from the table, his movements precise, almost ritualistic. He gathered the few items he would need. A small, tarnished brass compass, its needle spinning wildly now, no longer tethered to magnetic north but to something else, something deeper. A small vial of his own blood, drawn moments earlier with a trembling hand and a sterile needle, and a single polished stone, smooth and gray, found on the beach, imbued now with his intent. These were the keys, the anchors for the Cout ritual. The maelstrom outside had momentarily hushed, as if holding its breath, waiting. The journal had been explicit, not the lighthouse itself, but a place lower down, a natural fissure in the rock face that led to a small, hidden cove accessible only at low tide. This was where the original pact had been forged, where the entity's tendrils first reached for the surface, and it was there that the counter-ritual had to be performed. The sky was an impossible bruise, purple and black, with sickly green flashes deep within the churning clouds. The path leading down to the cove was treacherous, slick with the viscous rain and the spreading, bioluminescent growths. He reached a section of the path where the cliff face narrowed dramatically, a jagged, natural archway carved by millennia of wind and sea. His grandfather's journal had marked it ominously, the border checkpoint. Now in the entity's remapped reality, it was more than just a geographical feature. The archway pulsed faintly, its stone surfaces exuding a faint, sweetish odor like decaying lilies. The world beyond the archway was subtly, terrifyingly different. The sea was no longer merely turbulent. It was a churning black mass, its surface roiling with impossible currents and flashes of deep, phosphorescent light. The air thrummed with a low, resonant vibration, a sound that resonated with the entity's true voice. He stood at the edge of the cove, the waves crashing against the rocks with a hunger that felt personal. He understood the immense personal cost, the risk of losing himself in the process of becoming another distorted echo in the entity's remapped world. But the alternative was unthinkable. The island, his reality, the memory of what he had lost, all would be consumed. Dean moved through the thickening fog, each step a deliberate push against the island's growing resistance. The lighthouse, a spectral spire against the bruised sky, pulsed with an internal, sickly luminescence, its beam no longer a beacon of safety but a frantic, disoriented flicker that seemed to tear at the fabric of the mist. He clutched the weathered leather journal to his chest, its pages a fragile shield against the encroaching madness. His grandfather's frantic scrawl, the stark warnings, the diagrams of impossible geometry that warped the very paper had become his roadmap. He understood now. The entity, not merely a predator, but a vast, unfathomable emptiness that sought to fill itself, to graft itself onto this world. It needed a tether, a point of entry, and the lighthouse, built on a seam in reality, was its chosen mouth. The wind shrieked, a chorus of tormented voices that seemed to know his name, twisting it into a guttural mockery. Dean ignored them. His grief, that raw, aching wound, had been honed into a razor's edge of determination. He would not let this thing consume what little remained of his world. The lighthouse door, usually a stubborn barrier, now hung ajar, groaning on a single hinge. Beyond it, the familiar spiral staircase seemed to stretch into an impossible helix, each step whispering with the damp chill of the day. The air inside was still heavy, yet vibrated with an unseen energy, like a tuning fork struck in the silence of a tomb. Each landing brought a fresh assault. He felt tendrils of despair, of longing, wrap around his mind, trying to pull him down, to make him surrender to the comfort of oblivion. He pushed past them, his breath ragged, his focus absolute. This was the entity's play, its psychological weapon, seeking to break him before he even reached its core. The final ascent to the lantern room was a struggle against an invisible current. The wind howled through unseen cracks, carrying the stench of decaying kelp and something utterly alien, an odor that scraped at the back of his throat. He reached the heavy, iron-bound door that guarded the top chamber. It was more than a door now. It was a threshold, a definitive boundary. This was the border checkpoint. Beyond it, there was no turning back, no retreat to the world he knew. He took a deep, shuddering breath, tasting salt and the acrid tang of ozone, and pushed. The door swung inward with a drawn-out, metallic groan, revealing the lantern room. It was transformed. The floor felt slick, not with water, but with a viscous, unseen residue that made his boots stick. And then he saw it. Not a creature, not a monster in the conventional sense, but a presence. Visions flashed. His desk, his maps dissolving into chaos, the face of his lost love, contorted, weeping tears of black water. The entity was attacking, not his body, but the very scaffolding of his sanity. Dean stumbled forward, pulling the ritual items from his bag, a small, tarnished silver compass, a vial of black ink made from deep-sea squid, and a sheet of aged parchment covered in his grandfather's most potent sigils. The sacrifice was not of life, but of the very lens through which he perceived it. He uncapped the ink, its scent sharp and metallic. With trembling hands, he began to draw, tracing the intricate, swirling patterns from his grandfather's journal onto the parchment. The compass lay at the center, its needle spinning wildly, refusing to settle. He drew a final, complex sigil, a binding not meant to ensnare and repel. Then, with a desperate resolve, he held the parchment over the compass. He closed his eyes, visualizing the intricate, precise lines of a map, the ordered grids, the boundaries that gave meaning to the world. He focused on the joy he once found in charting the unknown, in bringing order to chaos. Then, with a guttural cry, he pressed the parchment down, crushing the compass beneath it, breaking its delicate mechanism, shattering the perfect circle of its glass. A wave of pure, unadulterated agony ripped through him, not physical, but existential. His mind reeled. For a moment, the world dissolved into a kaleidoscope of impossible colors and shifting dimensions. He felt a profound, aching emptiness where his sense of direction, his innate ability to conceptualize space and order had once resided. The sacrifice was made. The entity shrieked, a sound that seemed to tear at the fabric of the island itself, a sound of ancient, boundless rage and pain. The swirling vortex tightened, contracting into a pinpoint of blackness. The floor beneath him stilled. The air cleared, though the stench of brine and something unnameable lingered. The entity was gone. Push back. He had sealed the portal, but at what cost? He looked at his hands, no longer seeing the precise instruments of a cartographer, but simply hands detached and unfamiliar. He could hear it now, not just the low thrum beneath the waves, but a distinct, resonant hum that vibrated in his teeth, a sound that seemed to emanate from the very bedrock of the island. It was the deep song, and it was reaching its crescendo. He followed the faint, almost imperceptible path, a trail he'd meticulously charted in his mind, past the gnarled, salt-blasted trees and the crumbling stone walls of forgotten settlements. His grandfather's old charts had been less about mapping terrain and more about delineating zones of influence, thresholds of sanity. Dean understood now. The island wasn't just a landmass, it was a living membrane, a thin veil over something incomprehensible. The path led him not to the lighthouse, but to a series of collapsed sea caves, their mouths gaping like wounds in the cliff face. The deep song surged, a symphony of crushing pressures and abyssal echoes, each note a probe into his skull. He He felt his thoughts fragmenting, his memories fraying at the edges. But beneath the terror, a strange clarity began to emerge, a cold, hard resolve forged from desperation. He pushed into the largest cave, the air inside thick with the scent of wet rock and something else, something vital and organic, like decomposing kelp mixed with old blood. The sound here was overwhelming, a physical force that pressed against his eardrums, threatened to burst them. He stumbled, catching himself on a slick, seaweed-covered boulder. Here, carved into the living rock, was a complex mandala, its lines worn smooth by centuries of erosion and, perhaps, ritual. At its center, a shallow basin pulsed with a faint, phosphorescent glow, mimicking the rhythmic thrum of the deep song. This was it, the nexus. The deep song wasn't merely a malevolent entity. It was the island's primal consciousness, an ancient intelligence that had always been here, predating man, predating even the land itself. It was the source of life and the bringer of oblivion. His grandfather hadn't been trying to destroy it. He had been trying to contain it, to appease it, to live in a precarious balance. Dean knelt by the basin, his hands trembling. The glowing liquid within was thick, viscous, swirling with an inner light that seemed to mirror the constellations. He understood the pact now. The island offered refuge, sustenance, a place to belong. In return, it demanded a guardian, someone to listen, to acknowledge, to feed the deep song, keeping its boundless hunger from consuming everything. He closed his eyes, the cacophony of the deep song threatening to splinter his mind. He had to make a choice, fight it and be consumed, or embrace it and become its new anchor. He had sought solitude, a fresh start. He found a burden instead, a burden he now understood was his inheritance. With a shuddering breath, Dean plunged his hands into the glowing liquid. The moment his skin made contact, a searing pain lanced through him, not physical, but existential. It was as if every atom of his being was being yoded, rewritten of the deep song. He screamed, a sound lost in the overwhelming sonic current. He felt the entity pour into him, not as an invasion, but as a profound, agonizing integration. His mind stretched, encompassing not just his own memories, but echoes of the island's millennia, the silent wisdom of the deep. He was no longer just Dean. He was a conduit, a vessel. The deep song resonated within his own bones, his own blood. When it was over, he lay gasping on the cold stone, drenched in sweat and the strange, metallic tang of the cave. The immediate, crushing pressure of the deep song had receded, replaced by a constant, internal hum, a low thrumming in his chest that he knew would never leave him. He sat up, his body aching, his mind oddly clear, yet profoundly changed. He could feel the island, every root, every stone, every creature. He was part of it. He staggered out of the cave, the fog still thick, but now it felt different, less menacing, more like a familiar shroud. He walked, not following a path, but guided by an instinct that was no longer entirely his own. He found himself on the old, disused road that led to the derelict pier, the only way off the island. Before the pier, a crumbling stone archway stood, a forgotten monument to a past attempt at order. Above it, a weathered sign, its paint long faded, still bore the faint, flaking letters, "Border Checkpoint." Dean stopped beneath the arch. He looked out at the churning, gray sea, at the endless expanse of fog that swallowed the horizon. He could leave. The small boat he'd used to reach the island was still moored at the pier, barely visible through the mist. He could walk through this archway, board the boat, and sail away. But where would he go? What would he do? He would carry the island with him forever. His old world, where he was a cartographer mapping the known, and this new world, where he was a guardian, bound to the ancient, unnoble song. He turned away from the pier, from the faint hope of escape. He looked back at the island shrouded in its eternal mist, and a profound, unsettling peace settled over him. The deep song was quiet now, or perhaps it was simply singing through him. He had found his fresh start, after all. It just wasn't the one he'd been looking for.